Recognizes Mr. Connolly from Virginia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Well, Professor Katzen put her finger on the title of this hearing, which shows you the intellectual dishonesty of y'all being here. Because this hearing is all about confirmation bias. And that bias is predicated on a false narrative and a mindless narrative that all regulation is burdensome, most of it's unnecessary or duplicative. And if we just, it reminds me of the scene in Amadeus, where Amadeus puts on his very first production for the emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the empire goes to greet him after the performance. And Amadeus asks, Mozart asks him, "What did you think?" And the emperor goes, "Well," and the court composer goes, "Too many notes." And the emperor goes, "Yes, too many notes. Cut out a few, it'd be perfect." That's the approach to regulation. Let's have, for every new regulation, let's cut out two, as if they're all the same. There's no intellectual distinction between saving a life and making sure a drug is, pure. Professor Katzen, Upton Sinclair at the turn of the 20th century wrote a book called The Jungle. It led Theodore Roosevelt, a Republican president, to actually insist on regulation on food safety for the first time in America. Did Americans benefit from that series of regulations, do you think?
I think they did.
Ralph Nader wrote a book called Unsafe at Any Speed. That book led directly to more intensive regulation of the auto industry. Did that save lives?
I think it did.
And by the way, did the auto industry crash as a result of this ridiculous, or on the lady from North Carolina's word, absurd regulation?
I do not think it did. It's
No.
still thriving.
No. Rachel Carson wrote a book called Silent Spring that led to the environmental movement in the United States and the creation of EPA under a Republican president, Richard Nixon. Do you think, well, we've already heard you, but I mean, do you think that that movement, the environmental movement in both clean air, clean water, and looking at dangerous pesticides and chemicals, was that a good thing?
I think that was a very good thing. And your questions also show that books are good
Yeah.
and should not be banned.
Oh, well, that's the kind of regulation some people seem to like. Now, is there a cost when we don't regulate? They've talked a lot. We've only heard about the cost of regulation. What about the cost of the lack of regulation? Does that ever happen?
It has happened, unfortunately, too frequently with disasters such as those mentioned by Mr. Rankin and some of the ones that I've talked about where lives are at stake, or in the financial area where savings are lost.
So during Trump's 4 years, and apparently that was just the paragon of deregulation, thank God, somebody cared about that. He reversed rules requiring oil and gas companies to monitor and repair leaks in the facilities, blocked coal companies from dumping debris into local streams, and mandating braking system upgrades for high-hazard trains, hauling flammable liquids like oil and ethanol. Gosh, what could go wrong with rescinding those kinds of regulations?
Derailments and explosions and threatening the air and therefore the life of the people in East Palestine.
Any example come to mind of what could go wrong with that recently?
Recently, yes. There have been several, 4, I think.
And for example, the one in Ohio, if I recall, not only did they have to evacuate parts of the community, but they're now worried about long-term environmental costs from the exposure to toxins from that derailment. Is that correct?
That's correct, and it's consistent with what we saw after 9/11. We thought after 9/11 that it was just at that time, but people who were on the site have suffered unbelievably torturous.
So really, it's sort of in the eye of the beholder, isn't it? In terms of deregulate or regulate at your peril, and somebody else is deciding what risks you ought to take. And the risk of this philosophy of regulation is bad, let's deregulate everything we can, is that the risk then falls on the public in terms of health, safety, and life and limb. And we've seen the consequences of taking that risk all too often. I yield back.